The year was 1886. Somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, under a sun that turned the air itself into fire, a small group of Apache warriors had reached the edge of what most men would call the end. Their legs carried them forward out of pure discipline, not strength. Their lips were cracked, their water was gone, and somewhere behind them, the sound of US Cavalry hooves was growing louder with every passing minute. Any other leader might have pushed the group harder, forced a desperate sprint toward the mountains. But Geronimo stopped. He knelt at the edge of a bone-dry riverbed, pressed his palm flat against the scorching sand, closed his eyes for just a moment, and then, with complete and quiet certainty, he began to dig. Not frantically, not out of desperation, but with the calm of a man who was not guessing. He knew exactly what was underneath. That single image, a man kneeling in silence while soldiers close in, contains an entire philosophy of survival that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. Because here is the truth that changes everything. The desert did not see those Apache warriors as victims, and it did not see the US Cavalry as conquerors. The desert simply waited to see who knew how to listen. The desert doesn't kill, ignorance does. In this video, we're going to excavate that knowledge, layer by layer, and by the time we return to Geronimo at the end, you will understand exactly why he was never afraid of dying of thirst. Welcome to Primal Echoes, where forgotten knowledge is brought back to life. To understand how Geronimo knew where to dig, we have to go back further, to the knowledge that was built over generations, passed down not through books, but through watching, through walking, and through surviving. The first layer of that knowledge was written in the plants themselves. Chief Cochise, leader of the Chiricahua Apache, called them green beacons. And once you understand what he meant, you will never look at a desert landscape the same way again. In the vast gray expanse of rock and dust, certain trees simply could not exist without a direct and constant connection to underground water. The narrow-leafed cottonwood told you that moisture was no deeper than 2 meters beneath your feet. Willows said the same. But the mesquite tree told a different story entirely. Its roots can drive downward 15 meters into the earth, reaching aquifers that no surface traveler could ever detect. For Cochise, a dense cluster of mesquite didn't just mean water was nearby. It meant water existed in that region, and that was enough to begin reading the land more carefully. But there was more to it than simply spotting the right tree. An experienced tracker read the condition of every leaf. Bright green and supple meant the groundwater was close to the surface, almost within reach. Yellowed or curled foliage was a warning. A drought had pulled the water table deeper, and digging here would cost more energy than it returned. This analysis took only minutes, but those minutes could mean the difference between life and a slow death under an open sky. American soldiers passed these same thickets every day and saw nothing but scrub. Cochise saw a map. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most history books completely ignore. Because the greatest reader of natural signs among all the Apache groups was not a chief, was not a general, was not a man at all. Her name was Lawson, and she was the only woman in the documented history of Apache warfare to be recognized as a frontline scout and strategic advisor by her own people. Every morning, while US soldiers woke to the sound of orders and the clang of equipment being checked, Lawson walked alone into the silence before sunrise. She was looking for things that would disappear within 2 hours, the window of time when the desert briefly revealed its deepest secrets. She searched for dew that lingered on certain rocks just a few minutes longer than the surrounding stone, because that slight dampness always indicated a cold source directly beneath. She watched for faint wisps of vapor rising from specific patches of ground, barely visible in the cool air, gone before the sun fully rose. And she followed the geometry of tracks left by desert animals through the night, because every creature that survived in that landscape already knew where the water was. Where those tracks converged in a dry riverbed, Lawson began to dig. She was never wrong, but knowing where to look was only the first half of the secret. Even when you found the right location, the desert still had one more test waiting for you, and most people failed it. Before we descend into the dry riverbeds, there is one more hidden layer of this survival system that you need to understand, because it saved entire communities in ways that even the US Army's best scouts never figured out. Deep in the rocky canyons of what is now New Mexico and Texas, nature had already done part of the work. In the narrow, winding gorges where direct sunlight barely reached the bottom, centuries of spring flooding had carved something extraordinary into the bedrock. Natural stone basins, sometimes holding hundreds of liters of the purest water, sitting in the cool shadow of canyon walls where evaporation slowed to almost nothing. The Apache called them tinajas, and Chief Victorio, one of the most brilliant tactical minds of the 19th century, built his entire guerrilla strategy around them. In 1880, Victorio's small detachment evaded multiple cavalry regiments for months, not because his warriors were faster or better armed, but because he had memorized a network of tinajas across the highlands that the army didn't know existed. While soldiers on the plains ran dry and were forced to retreat to major rivers, Victorio's people rested in the mountains, fully supplied, completely invisible. But here is the part that most people never hear. American scouts occasionally stumbled upon a tinaja. They would scoop water from the top layer, drink, declare it nearly empty, and move on. What they didn't understand was that the narrow neck of the basin concealed a vast interior volume below. The tinaja was not a pond, it was a vault, and only those with the right key could open it. Victorio's people retrieved water from the very bottom, using bound agave stalks as tools. And before leaving, they covered the surface with dry branches, rocks, and thorny shrubs, not just to hide it from enemies, but to slow evaporation for the next group that would follow the same route. This was not just survival, this was infrastructure. Now, the tinajas worked perfectly in the mountains. But on the open plains, in the flat, exposed desert where Geronimo now stood, there were no canyon walls, no stone basins, no shade. There was only the dry riverbed stretching in both directions, and the sound of hooves growing closer. This is where a completely different kind of knowledge took over. The Apache understood something about dry riverbeds that no geology textbook of that era had ever written down. A dry riverbed is never truly dry. Water doesn't disappear, it retreats. It sinks beneath a thick layer of compacted sand and weights. And if you know how to read the riverbed's anatomy, you can find exactly where it's hiding. The key lies in the outer bend of any meandering channel. When spring floods rush through, centrifugal force pushes the water hard against the outer edge, eroding the bedrock into deep hidden pockets. After the surface dries completely, those pockets hold on to significant volumes of water far below the sand. The inner bend, by contrast, is always alluvial, always dry, always a dead end. Geronimo's group knew this. They studied the angle of the bank, looked for the shadow cast by the high outer edge protecting the soil from direct sun, and then came the final confirmation. The tracker pressed his palm flat into the top layer of sand and held it there. If the sand at the depth of a hand stayed hot, they moved on. But if the fingers felt the faint coolness rising up through the grains, that capillary chill that moisture sends upward through microscopic pores, that was the signal. That was the green light. The right location had been found, but knowing where to dig was still only half the equation. Because what happened next, the tool they used, the technique they employed, and the discipline they maintained in those final 30 minutes, that is where most people, even today, would have failed completely. And that is exactly where we are going next. The Apache did not use iron shovels. They did not carry the heavy steel entrenching tools that weighed down every soldier in the US Cavalry's supply train. Their primary instrument for extracting water from the earth was a simple wooden stick, and in the hands of someone who truly understood it, that stick outperformed every piece of metal the army brought into the desert. It was called the yuku. Chief Jew, leader of the Nedni Apache, understood the yuku the way a surgeon understands a scalpel, not as a blunt instrument, but as a precise tool that demanded technique, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the material it was working with. The wood was selected carefully, always from the hardest mountain oak or sturdy juniper. The tip was sharpened with a stone knife and then charred slowly over fire until it turned black and dense as bone. Every warrior carried one and considered it no less essential than a bow or a blade. But the yuku was only as effective as the method behind it. The digger never drove straight down from the top. Instead, the stick was inserted into the sand at an angle, working with slow circular motions, prying the soil loose and lifting it out layer by layer. This technique was everything. It prevented the walls from collapsing inward, which was the fatal mistake that American soldiers made every time they tried to replicate the process with their steel tools. They dug fast, they dug hard, and they destroyed the delicate structure of the sand around them. What they pulled out was muddy sludge, undrinkable, useless, demoralizing. The Apache pulled out a filtration well. When the Yuku reached the moist layer, the digging slowed even further, deliberately, carefully, leaving a thin layer of clean sand at the bottom. That sand became the filter. Water seeped upward through it slowly, leaving suspended particles behind, arriving at the surface clear and safe. And this is where the 2-hour rule comes in, the most precisely calibrated survival protocol in the history of the American Southwest. The first 30 minutes belonged entirely to reading the landscape, assessing the sun's position, confirming the indicator plants, studying the outer bend of the arroyo, pressing the palm into the sand to feel the capillary chill. This was intellectual work, and a mistake here made everything that followed worthless. The next 60 minutes belonged to the Yuku, smooth, controlled movements. No rushing, no wasted effort, because in extreme heat, every unnecessary motion stole water from the body faster than the desert itself. The depth of the excavation ranged from 1 to 2 meters, depending on the aquifer's density, and by the end of that hour, dark moisture-saturated sand would finally appear at the bottom. Then came the final 30 minutes. And this, not the digging, not the reading of plants, not the analysis of the riverbed. This was the hardest part, because the group had to sit, in the shade, in silence, completely still, while an empty pit slowly filled with the thing their bodies were screaming for. Leaders like Ju enforced this discipline absolutely. No one approached the well before the time was complete. No one reached in to scoop murky water before the filter had done its work. The army failed here every single time, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked the one thing that the desert demanded above all else. Patience was not weakness, it was the final weapon. While the well filled, there was still the question of what happened after. How water gathered in the middle of a desert could be carried across 50 miles of open terrain without losing a single drop. The answer came from the women of the tribe, and it is one of the most overlooked engineering achievements in the entire history of the American Southwest. Chief Nana, a logistics genius who continued leading raids well into his 70s, understood that finding water was only half the mission. Storing and transporting it without waste was the other half. The solution was the tuss, a woven basket jug made from flexible willow or sumac branches, shaped into a narrow-necked vessel, and then coated inside and out with hot piñon pine resin that hardened into a completely watertight seal. These were not simple containers. They were precision instruments, and the women who made them were the unsung engineers of Apache survival. The narrow neck minimized evaporation and kept out dust and insects. The shape was specifically designed to minimize sloshing at a full run or on horseback, because silent movement behind enemy lines was not optional. American metal canteens clanged against saddles and gear, announcing positions from hundreds of meters away. The tuss made no sound. Nana took this system one step further. Before any raid or long march, his men would pre-dig wells along the planned retreat route, fill tuss baskets, and bury them in cool sand at carefully marked locations. When the group came through on the run, they didn't stop for 2 hours. They dug up a ready cache, drank, refilled, and kept moving. The army called it supernatural endurance. It was engineering. Now we return to where we began. The Sonoran Desert, 1886. Geronimo kneeling at the outer bend of a dry riverbed, his palm pressed into the sand, feeling that faint capillary chill rising up through the grains. The cavalry was close. The group was exhausted, and for 30 minutes after the Yuku had done its work, every person in that group sat in absolute silence and waited. No panic, no reaching into the unfiltered mud. The discipline held, and when the water finally cleared at the bottom of that well, when it came through the sand pale and clean and real, the women filled the tuss baskets first, then the children drank, then the elders, then the warriors. By the time the advance guard of the US Cavalry reached that stretch of riverbed, there was nothing left but an empty pit and tracks leading deeper into the desert. Knowledge had outrun power, again, but that knowledge came at a cost that is almost impossible to measure. In 1872, Chief Cochise sat across from General Oliver Otis Howard and negotiated one of the only genuine diplomatic victories in the history of the Apache Wars. He refused to relocate to the arid plains of New Mexico. He demanded a reservation in the Chiricahua Mountains, not for sentimental reasons, not out of stubbornness, but because those mountains held the springs and the tinajas that his people's survival literally depended on. Howard agreed. It was a rare moment when ancient knowledge was recognized as the strategic asset it truly was. But 4 years later, in 1876, the US government dissolved the Chiricahua Reservation. And with that single political decision, they didn't just take land. They cut the Apache off from the water network that had sustained them for generations. What followed was not a military defeat. It was a slow severing of people from the knowledge and knowledge from the land it belonged to. The Apache did not lose because they were weak. They lost because the world around them had decided that this kind of intelligence, patient, ecological, generational, no longer had a place at the table of power. And yet, here is what that world got wrong. The knowledge never actually died. Today, hydrologists studying subsurface water flow in arid regions are rediscovering the same principles. The outer bend of a dry channel, the capillary effect beneath compacted sand, the indicator species that mark underground aquifers. They are publishing papers on techniques that Apache scouts mastered 2 centuries ago without a single instrument beyond their own hands and their own eyes. So the real question this video leaves you with is not about history, it is about now. In a world that is facing water scarcity on a scale our ancestors never imagined, what does it mean that we nearly lost this knowledge entirely, and that it took us this long to start listening again? If that question stays with you, then this video did its job. This is Primal Echoes, where the past speaks and the present finally listens. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.